The ache in Alara's back was a familiar companion, as constant as the biting wind that whipped across the sodden fields of Oakhaven. Autumn, in the year of our Lord 1347, had been a miser, yielding a harvest as thin and mean as Reeve Godrich's smile. Each swing of the heavy hoe, caked with the cloying mud of Lord Byford's land, sent a jolt through her shoulders, down her spine, and into legs that felt older than her 24 years. The thin, white scar that traced a line from her left temple to her jaw tightened with the effort, a silent reminder of a lesson learned too young, that the world was sharp and heedlessness bred pain. Her gaze, grey and weary, swept over the bent backs of the other villagers. Her father Giles, a man shaped by toil into a question mark, moved with the slow, grim rhythm of inevitability. Further off, her younger brother Tom coughed, a dry, rasping sound that snagged at her heart more painfully than any thorn. He was 16, but the damp and the endless work had stolen the bloom from his youth, leaving him pale and vulnerable. Protecting Tom was the sun around which Alara's own bleak world revolved. "Mind your rows, Alara." Reeve Godrich's voice, oily and sharp, cut through the damp air. He sat comfortably on his sturdy cob, a leather jerkin puffing out his portly frame, his small eyes missing nothing. "The Lord expects a clean field, not a weedy prayer meeting." Alara bit back the retort that clawed at her throat. "The Lord expects, and you grow fat on his expectations, Godric." Instead she nodded, a curt dip of her head, and focused on the stubborn clods of earth. Her hands, calloused and chapped, gripped the hoe tighter. The single woolen tunic, dyed a patchy brown with walnut husks, chafed her skin, its scent a pungent mix of wood smoke, old sweat, and the damp earth. She yearned for the luxury of a second shift, for the simple dignity of cleanliness, but such things were as distant as the king in London. Later, huddled in their one-room wattle and daub hut, the meagre fire doing little to dispel the creeping chill, the smell was a complex tapestry, stale beer, human sweat, the lingering scent of boiled turnips and barley, and the ever-present damp. Giles snored softly on his straw pallet. Tom, beside her, shivered despite the shared threadbare blanket. Alara lay awake, listening to the wind moan through the ill-fitting door, her mind a whirl of anxieties. The tithe had been paid, but Godric had hinted at an extra levy for the Lord's upcoming Saints' Day feast. Where would it come from? Their stores were already dangerously low. The forest, looming dark and forbidden, whispered its dangerous temptations. A snared rabbit, a few fallen branches for a better fire. But the Lord's foresters were vigilant, and the penalty for poaching was mutilation, or worse. She remembered the woman years ago. Martha, her name was, accused of slandering the previous Reeve. Alara had been a child, peering through a gap in the crowd, her stomach churning as they fastened the scold's bridle, the cold iron cage over Martha's head, the metal tongue forcing her silence. The image was seared into her memory, the shame, the helplessness, the brutal power of a few words twisted by authority. It was a lesson in caution, a bridle for her own sharp tongue. A particularly violent gust of wind rattled the door, and Tom coughed again, a deeper, more worrying sound this time. Alara reached out in the darkness, her rough hand finding his forehead. Hot, too hot. Fear, cold and sharp, pierced through her weariness. Sickness in autumn with winter looming was a death sentence for the weak, and Tom was weak. The next morning the church bell, its clang a merciless summons, found Alara already on her feet. Tom was feverish, his breathing shallow. Giles, his face etched with a stoic despair, merely grunted. He'll sweat it out. Work waits for no man or boy. But Alara knew better. She had seen this fever before. She needed herbs, and the only one in the village with any real knowledge was Agnes, the midwife and wort-wife, a woman as old and gnarled as the ancient oak by the river. Agnes lived in a slightly less dilapidated hut at the edge of the village. The air inside was thick with the scent of dried herbs, a welcome change from the usual village miasma. The old woman, her face a road map of wrinkles, peered at Alara with eyes as sharp and knowing as a hawk's. "Fever, you say?" Agnes's voice was raspy. "The boy Tom?" "Aye, he's always been a delicate one." She poked at a bundle of yarrow hanging from the rafters. "The damp clings to him. What have you given him?" "Water, a little broth. He keeps nothing down." Alara's voice was tight with suppressed panic. Agnes hummed, a sound like dry leaves skittering. "The Reeve's been sniffing around for extra. The Lord's feast, he says. Folk are hard-pressed." She looked directly at Ilara. Some fevers, they are a mercy child, a release from burdens. Ilara recoiled as if struck. He is my brother, and a mouth to feed with little strength to earn his keep, Agnes stated, not cruelly, but as a simple, hard fact of their lives. Still, for your mother's sake, she was a good woman. I'll give you what I can. Willow bark for the fever, some comfrey if his chest is tight. But it will cost. A sliver of your father's barley bread, perhaps, or a promise of assistance when my own back is too stiff for gathering. The unspoken hung in the air. Assistance could mean anything, from mucking out Agnes's small pigsty to other, less palatable tasks the village sometimes required of its more vulnerable members. Ilara's stomach tightened. The bread. I'll bring it. She hurried back, the small pouch of herbs clutched in her hand. The village was stirring. The smell of burning peat and stale beer filled the air. Children, already looking like miniature, weary adults, were being chivied towards the fields. She saw Reeve Godric outside the small makeshift smithy, his voice raised as he harangued Watt, the blacksmith, over a delayed repair to a ploughshare. Godric's power was a constant, suffocating presence. Tom was worse. His skin was a parchment-like grey, his lips cracked. Ilara forced a decoction of willow bark between them, her heart a cold stone in her chest. Giles had already left for the fields, his silence a heavy weight. Survival meant work, even if your son was dying. That was the unwritten law of Oakhaven. As she tended to Tom, a shadow fell across the doorway. Reeve Godric. His portly figure seemed to fill the small entrance. The boy still abid. Ilara, his tone was deceptively mild. A pity. Every hand is needed. The Lord Byford has expectations. His eyes flickered around the mean hut, lingering on the small pile of firewood, the chipped wooden bowls. And his dues must be met. The special levy, for instance, 2 good hens or their equivalent in grain by week's end, from every household. 2 hens? Ilara's voice was barely a whisper. They had 1 scrawny chicken whose egg-laying days were mostly behind it. Reeve, we have nothing. Godric chuckled, a humourless sound. Then you best find something, girl. The Lord is not a patient man, nor am I. His gaze dropped to Tom, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes. Annoyance? Contempt? A sickly boy is a drain. Perhaps Agnes is right. Some are better off released from their earthly troubles. He turned, his bulk momentarily blocking the light, then was gone. Ilara stared after him, a cold fury mixing with her fear. He knows, Agnes told him. The village was a web of whispers, of shared hardships and petty betrayals, all under the Reeves' watchful eye. Tom coughed, a weak, fluttering sound, and the fury solidified into a desperate resolve. She would not let Tom die. Not to the fever, not to Godric's callous indifference. She would find a way, even if it meant defying the laws of God and man. The forest whispered again, no longer a temptation, but a desperate necessity. The decision, once made, settled in Ilara's stomach like a stone, cold but solid. Poaching was a hanging offence, or at the very least a flogging and the loss of a hand. But Tom's shallow breaths, the heat radiating from his small frame, were more immediate threats. The Lord's justice was distant. Death was in their hut. That night, under a sliver of a moon that offered little comfort and even less light, Ilara slipped from the hut. She'd waited until Giles's snores were deep and regular, until Tom had fallen into a restless, fever-induced sleep. She wore her usual tunic, its drab colour an advantage in the gloom. In her hand she clutched a crudely fashioned snare made from stripped willow bark and a bit of hoarded twine, a skill learned in childhood, half forgotten, now desperately recalled. The forest edge was a wall of deeper blackness against the grey sky. The air here was different, cooler, smelling of damp earth, decaying leaves, and the faint, musky scent of unseen animals. Every snap of a twig under her worn leather soles sounded like a thunderclap to her heightened senses. Fear was a live thing, coiling in her belly, but the image of Tom's face, pale and drawn, spurred her onward. She knew the game trails, the places where rabbits and sometimes even a young deer might pass. It was knowledge gleaned from a childhood spent skirting the forest's edge, gathering fallen wood or berries, always with one eye out for the Lord's foresters. She found a likely spot, a narrow track between thickets of hawthorn, and set her snare with trembling fingers, anchoring it to a sturdy sapling. She then moved on, setting 2 more in different locations, her heart pounding with a mixture of hope and terror. Returning to the village empty-handed was a small agony. The risk had been taken, but the reward was yet uncertain. She crept back into the hut, the scent of the forest clinging to her, and lay down beside Tom, her body thrumming with adrenaline. Sleep was impossible. Before dawn she was out again, her movements furtive. The first snare was empty, the second also. Despair began to gnaw at her. Had she been a fool? Then, at the third snare, her heart leaped. A rabbit, small but plump enough, struggled weakly, its eyes wide with terror. A swift, brutal twist, and it was still. Alara felt a pang of something, regret, but quickly suppressed it. This was Tom's life. Hiding the rabbit under her tunic, its warmth a strange comfort against her skin, she hurried back. The challenge now was to butcher and cook it without raising suspicion. The smell of roasting meat, a rare luxury, would travel. She decided to risk a small fire outside, claiming to be boiling more willow bark for Tom, and would cook the rabbit quickly, in pieces, buried in the embers. The day was a torment of anxiety. Godric passed their hut twice, his eyes lingering. Agnes, fetching water from the well, gave Alara a long, unreadable look. Did she suspect, or was it merely the usual village scrutiny? Tom, after consuming a little of the precious broth Alara managed to coax into him, seemed a fraction stronger. His fever hadn't broken, but his eyes held a spark of awareness they'd lacked the day before. It was enough. By week's end, Tom was slowly, undeniably mending. The rabbit, eked out over several days, had provided sustenance. Alara, gaunt with worry and lack of sleep, felt a flicker of triumph. She had defied the odds. But Oakhaven was a small place, and secrets, like the scent of cooked meat, had a way of spreading. It was during the obligatory Sunday Mass that the trouble truly began. Father Aric, a thin, anxious man whose sermons always seemed to dwell on the torments of hell, was droning on about the evils of disobedience. Alara, kneeling on the cold stone floor, her stomach rumbling, tried to focus on her prayers, but her mind kept replaying the furtive trips to the forest. After Mass, as the villagers shuffled out, blinking in the watery sunlight, Reeve Godric approached her. He was not alone. 2 of Lord Byford's men-at-arms, burly figures in worn leather jacks, flanked him. Their presence sent a ripple of unease through the departing congregation. Alara, daughter of Giles. Godric's voice was unctuous, but his eyes were hard. A word with you. Her heart plummeted. Reeve, it has come to my attention, Godric continued, his voice loud enough for the nearby villagers to hear, that some in this village do not respect the Lord's laws, that they take what is not theirs, that they trespass in the Lord's forest and steal his game. A collective gasp went through the onlookers. Alara felt their eyes on her, curious, fearful, some perhaps even a little triumphant. In a village where everyone was hungry, envy was a bitter weed. I don't know what you mean, Reeve, Alara managed, her voice thinner than she'd intended. Oh, I think you do. Godric smiled, a slow, predatory stretching of his lips. The boy Tom made a remarkable recovery, did he not? From a fever that had him at death's door. Such recoveries often require special sustenance not easily come by for honest folk. One of the men-at-arms stepped forward. We searched your hut this morning, girl, while you were piously praying, no doubt. He held up a small, bloodied rabbit skin and a few telltale bones, wrapped in a rag. Found these buried beneath your hearth. Funny place to keep your dinner scraps. The blood drained from Alara's face. She had been so careful, or so she'd thought. But in her exhaustion, she must have been careless with the disposal. Poaching is a serious offence, Alara, Godric said, his voice dripping with false sympathy. A very serious offence indeed. Lord Byford does not take kindly to thieves. Giles pushed his way through the crowd, his face ashen. Reeve, please. She's a good girl. She meant no harm. The boy, he was so sick. The law is the law, Giles, Godric snapped, his jovial mask falling away to reveal the petty tyrant beneath. And your daughter has broken it. She will be taken to the Lord's Manor for judgment. He nodded to the men-at-arms. Take her. Hands, rough and strong, seized Alara's arms. She didn't struggle. What was the use? She saw Tom at the edge of the crowd, his face a mask of terror, tears streaming down his cheeks. Agnes was there too, her expression unreadable. Had she been the one to whisper to Godric? Or had it been someone else? Someone who had smelled the forbidden meat, someone who had seen her furtive movements. It scarcely mattered. As they marched her away from Oakhaven, past the fields she had toiled in, past the forest that had offered both salvation and damnation, Alara felt a chilling despair. She had saved Tom, yes, but in doing so she had almost certainly condemned herself. The image of Martha, her face contorted behind the scold's bridle, rose in her mind. What awaited her at Lord Byford's manor? A swift judgment, a painful punishment. She had sought a small space of dignity, a moment of defiance, and the world, in its relentless cruelty, was about to crush her for it. The silence she had feared was now being imposed upon her, not by an iron bridle, but by the unyielding weight of feudal power. Lord Byford's manor was a hulking stone edifice, a stark contrast to the flimsy huts of Oakhaven. It wasn't a grand castle, more a fortified farmhouse, but to Alara it felt as imposing as the Tower of London itself. Smoke curled from its chimneys, carrying the tantalizing scent of roasting meat, a scent that now mocked her. She was thrust into a damp, windowless cell in the undercroft, the air thick with the smell of stale straw and despair. It was here she waited, for how long she couldn't tell. Time became a meaningless blur of hunger, fear, and the incessant drip of water somewhere in the darkness. Her trial, when it came, was a formality. Lord Byford, a portly man with a perpetually florid face and eyes that seemed to bulge with indignation, presided. Reeve Godric stood beside him, preening like a well-fed cat. The rabbit skin and bones were presented as irrefutable evidence. Alara was not asked to speak, nor would it have mattered if she had. Her guilt was predetermined. "The law is clear," Lord Byford boomed, his voice echoing in the small, smoky hall. "The game in my forest belongs to me. To steal it is to steal from me, and thievery will not be tolerated." He paused, enjoying the dramatic effect. "You will be made an example, girl. Let others in Oakhaven see the price of disobedience." Her sentence was to be 3 days in the stocks, followed by 20 lashes in the village square, and the branding of a P for poacher on her left palm. A wave of nausea washed over Alara. The stocks meant public humiliation, exposure to the elements and the jeers, or worse, the missiles of the villagers. The lashes would be agony, and the brand would mark her for life, a constant reminder of her transgression, a visible sign of her shame. The days in the stocks were a blur of misery. Rain lashed down, soaking her to the bone. The cold seeped into her joints, making them ache with a ferocity that rivaled the pain in her back. Children, emboldened by their parents' silence or muttered condemnations, threw mud and rotten vegetables. Some adults spat. Agnes passed by once, her face averted. Alara saw her father at a distance, his shoulders slumped, his face a mask of helpless grief. Tom was nowhere to be seen. Giles had likely kept him away, and for that Alara was grateful. She wouldn't have him witness this. The worst part was the thirst and the helplessness. Her hands and head were locked, her body contorted into an unnatural position. The smell of her own filth, mixed with the decaying refuse thrown at her, was overpowering. She drifted in and out of a hazy consciousness, her mind replaying Godric's sneering face, Lord Byford's booming voice, the terror in Tom's eyes. Had it been worth it? For a few mouthfuls of rabbit that had saved her brother? Yes, 1,000 times yes, but the price was brutal. On the 3rd day they released her, her limbs stiff and trembling, her spirit battered. The lashing was next. She was tied to a post in the centre of the village, her back bared. The crowd gathered, a silent, watchful circle. Reeve Godric himself held the whip, a thick leather thong that whistled through the air before it bit into her flesh. The first lash stole her breath, a searing, incandescent pain that ripped a scream from her throat. Each subsequent blow was a fresh wave of agony. She bit her lip until it bled, trying to stifle her cries, refusing to give Godric the satisfaction. But the pain was relentless, overwhelming. She lost count. The world narrowed to the sound of the whip, the burning torment on her back, and the coppery taste of blood in her mouth. When it was finally over, she sagged against the post, barely conscious. 2 villagers, their faces grim, cut her down and half carried, half dragged her back to her hut. Giles was there, his face a ruin. He said nothing, but gently, awkwardly, began to clean her wounds with cool water and rags. The touch, clumsy as it was a small island of kindness in a sea of pain. The branding, a few days later, once she could stand without collapsing, was almost an anticlimax after the lashing. The glowing iron, the sizzle of her own flesh, the acrid smell, it was another violation, another mark of ownership by a system designed to crush her. But something inside Alara had hardened. The pain was still there, a dull throbbing ache in her palm and a fiery map across her back, but the fear had lessened, replaced by a cold, simmering rage. Life in Oakhaven changed after that. She was marked, an outcast. Villagers who had once offered a curt nod now averted their eyes. Children sometimes whispered and pointed. Work was harder, as her branded palm made gripping tools painful, and her back still flared with agony at the slightest exertion. Godric seemed to take a particular pleasure in assigning her the most unpleasant tasks, his small eyes glinting with malice. But Elara endured. She had to, for Tom. He was fully recovered now, though the experience had left him quieter, his eyes older. He helped her as much as he could, his thin frame surprisingly resilient. He would often sit with her in the evenings, not speaking much, but his presence was a comfort. One evening, as a chill wind whistled around the hut, Agnes appeared at their door. She carried a small pot. "Full spurt ointment," she said, her voice gruff, "for the back, and this," she produced a small tightly wrapped bundle of leaves. "Chew them, for the pain in your hand." Elara stared at her. "Why?" Agnes shrugged, her gaze uncharacterum. "The boy lives. You paid a hard price. No need to suffer more than is God's will." He paused. Godric overstepped. Even Lord Byford thought the sentence harsh, but a reeve must maintain order. Her eyes met Elara's. Some orders are crueler than others. She left as quietly as she had come. The ointment helped. The leaves, when chewed, dulled the ache in her palm. It was a small mercy, but it was something. Elara began to notice other small things. A villager might accidentally leave a slightly larger share of gleaned grain near her pile. Another might offer a quiet word of warning if Godric was in a particularly foul mood. It wasn't friendship, not yet, but it was a subtle shift. A grudging respect, perhaps, for her endurance, or a shared resentment of Godric's petty tyranny. The scar on Elara's face was a mark of an old accident. The brand on her palm was a mark of deliberate cruelty, of societal judgment. But as the weeks turned into months and the raw wounds on her back healed into ridged scars, Elara began to see them differently. They were marks of survival. She had faced the worst the system could throw at her, and she was still standing. The silence imposed by the scold's bridle she had once feared was now a choice. She spoke little, but her eyes observed everything, and in the quiet spaces of her mind a new kind of resolve was taking root. Oakhaven had tried to break her. Reeve Godric had tried to silence her, but Elara was not yet done. The anger was still there, but now it was colder, more focused. She was learning a different kind of language, the language of quiet resistance, of enduring not just for Tom, but for herself. The world was still a brutal place, but Elara was finding her own harsh strength within it. She was a survivor, marked but not defeated. And in the silent, watchful eyes of some of the other villagers, she began to see not just pity, but the faintest glimmer of something else. A shared understanding, a spark of defiance waiting for its moment. The scold's silence could, perhaps, one day be broken by many voices. The winter that followed was as bitter as foretold. The meagre harvest dwindled rapidly. Hunger became a constant, gnawing presence in every hut in Oakhaven, its chill more pervasive than the frost that silvered the bare fields. Elara, Giles and Tom subsisted on thin barley gruel, supplemented by whatever wizened roots Elara could dig from the frozen earth at the forest's edge. The brand on her palm throbbed with a dull ache in the cold, a perpetual reminder. Her back, though scarred, had regained some of its strength, but the memory of the whip was a phantom that sometimes made her flinch from an unexpected touch. Reeve Godric, however, seemed to thrive. His cheeks grew rounder, his belly more pronounced. Rumours circulated, whispers in the dim light of the church or over sputtering fires, that he was diverting more than his fair share of the Lord's grain for his own larder, or selling it on the quiet to desperate hamlets further afield. The villagers, weakened by hunger and cowed by his authority, muttered but did little else. Open defiance was a luxury none could afford. Elara watched and listened. The cold rage that had settled in her after her punishment had not dissipated. It had merely banked itself like embers waiting for a breeze. She saw the fear in her father's eyes deepen with each passing day, the way Tom's cough returned with the icy winds, more persistent this time. Her own hunger was a dull ache she could mostly ignore, but theirs was a sharper pain. One particularly bleak morning, Godric announced a new work detail. Lord Byford, insulated in his warm manor, had decided a new ditch was needed to drain a waterlogged field before spring planting, a field that primarily benefited his own demesne. The work was to begin immediately, despite the frozen ground and the weakened state of the villagers. The Lord's will must be done, Godric declared, his breath pluming in the frosty air. He scanned the shivering group of men and women. "And any who shirk will answer to me and then to him." His gaze deliberately fell on Elara. The ground was like iron. The primitive wooden spades and mattocks bounced off its frozen surface, jarring arms and backs already aching from cold and malnutrition. Progress was agonizingly slow. By midday, several older villagers had collapsed, their strength utterly spent. Godric, wrapped in a thick woolen cloak, merely berated them for their weakness. Elara, working beside her father, felt her anger solidify into a desperate clarity. This wasn't just hardship. It was a slow, deliberate grinding down of their lives for the whim of a distant lord and the profit of a petty tyrant. Tom, too weak for the ditch-digging, had been assigned to gathering firewood under Godric's direct and often cruel supervision. She worried for him constantly. That evening, as they huddled in their hut, the silence was broken by a ragged cough from Tom. It was worse than before, flecked with blood. Giles looked at his son, then at Elara, his eyes filled with a despair so profound it was almost a physical blow. There's nothing left," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "The grain is almost gone. He needs more." Elara knew what he meant. More food, more warmth, things they did not have. The memory of the snared rabbit returned, not as a source of guilt, but as a stark reminder of what it took to survive. But another trip to the forest was too risky now. Godric watched her like a hawk. It was Agnes who offered an unexpected, dangerous sliver of an idea. She came to their hut a few days later, ostensibly to check on Tom, bringing a small poultice of mashed dock leaves. "The boy fades," she said, her voice low after examining Tom. She looked at Elara. "Godric's been boasting, says his own stores are plentiful, says a wise reeve always looks after himself first." Her eyes, sharp and knowing, held Elara's. "Some say his grain store, the one behind his cottage, is not as secure as the Lord's. A loose board in the back wall, perhaps, overlooked." Elara's breath caught. Was Agnes suggesting theft? From the reeve himself? The audacity of it was terrifying. But the image of Tom, his life ebbing away, was more so. "That would be a great risk, Agnes," Elara said, her voice barely audible. Agnes shrugged. "Life in Oakhaven is a great risk, child. Some risks are just quicker than others." She met Elara's gaze again. "A child's cough in winter, with no food in the belly, that is a slow, certain risk." She rose to leave. Just village chatter, of course, pay it no mind. But Elara could pay it nothing but mind. The idea took root, a desperate seed in the barren soil of her options. To steal from Godric, the man who had humiliated and tortured her, the man who was starving them all while he feasted. There was a grim justice in it that appealed to the cold rage within her. But the fear was immense. If caught, it wouldn't be the stocks and a lashing this time. It would be the gallows. She confided in her father. Giles, surprisingly, did not immediately dismiss it. The fight had gone out of him, replaced by a dull, aching fear for his son. If you are sure, Elara," he stammered, his eyes not meeting hers. "But the risk. The risk of doing nothing is Tom's death, father," Elara said, her voice steady. The plan, if it could be called that, was simple, desperate, and likely foolish. Under the cover of a moonless, stormy night, if the heavens were kind enough to provide one, Elara would attempt to find this loose board Agnes had spoken of. She would take only what they absolutely needed. A small sack of grain. Enough to see Tom through the worst of the winter. Enough to give them a fighting chance. The waiting was a torment. Each night, Elara watched the sky, praying for clouds and wind. Tom grew weaker. Godric grew bolder, his demands more frequent, his cruelty more open. He seemed to revel in their suffering. Then, one night, the storm came. Wind howled through Oakhaven, rattling shutters and whipping rain against the flimsy walls of the huts. It was perfect. Wrapped in her thin cloak, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs, Elara slipped out into the maelstrom. The village was deserted, everyone huddled inside. Godric's cottage was at the other end of the village, near the church. The journey, though short, felt like miles, each step fraught with the fear of discovery. She found the grain store, a small, windowless shed attached to Godric's cottage. The wind shrieked around her, tearing at her cloak, the rain stinging her face. She felt along the back wall, her fingers numb with cold, searching for the loose board Agnes had mentioned. Her branded palm ached fiercely. Then her fingers brushed against it. A plank that shifted slightly under pressure. With a small, sharp stone she'd brought, she began to pry at the edges. The wood was old and damp, splintering. It seemed an eternity, the sounds of her efforts swallowed by the storm. Finally, with a groan, the board came loose enough for her to slip her hand inside. Her fingers touched the rough sacking of a grain bag. Relief, sharp and fierce, washed over her. She worked the opening wider, just enough to reach in and scoop out grain into the small pouch she'd hidden under her cloak. She took only what she thought they needed for a few weeks, resisting the urge to take more, to punish Godric for his greed. This was about survival, not revenge. Not yet. She replaced the board as best she could, hoping the storm would mask any signs of her entry. Then, clutching the precious pouch, she fled back through the tempest, her heart soaring with a wild, terrified triumph. Back in their hut, Giles was waiting, his face a mask of anxiety in the flickering light of a single tallow dip. When he saw the grain, tears welled in his eyes. He said nothing, merely clasped Elara's hand, his grip surprisingly strong. Over the next few days, with nourishing gruel made from the stolen grain, Tom began to rally. The colour returned to his cheeks, his cough lessened. The small act of defiance had bought them time. But Elara knew it was only a temporary reprieve. Godric would eventually notice the missing grain, and his suspicion, she knew, would fall on anyone who seemed to be faring even marginally better than their neighbours. Especially on her, the branded poacher. The scold's silence was a fragile thing, easily broken by desperation, but the consequences were always lurking, waiting to pounce. The storm had passed, but another, more personal one was surely gathering. The stolen grain, carefully rationed, saw Tom through the worst of his illness. A fragile strength returned to his limbs, and the blood-flecked cough subsided. Elara watched him with a fierce, protective love, the memory of her desperate act a constant thrum beneath the surface of her days. The fear of discovery was a shadow that never quite left her, but the sight of Tom eating, of a little life returning to his eyes, was a shield against it. Reeve Godric, predictably, did notice the discrepancy in his stores. His voice could be heard booming through the village, full of bluster and threats, accusing unnamed villains of treachery and theft. He conducted haphazard searches of several huts, turning over meagre belongings, his eyes narrowed with suspicion. When he came to Elara's hut, his gaze lingered on Tom, who, though still thin, no longer looked like a boy at death's door. Remarkable, the boy's recovery, Godric said, his voice smooth as poisoned honey. One might almost think a miracle had occurred, or perhaps a well-stocked larder. Elara met his gaze, her expression carefully neutral. The brand on her palm seemed to burn. "We share what little we have, Reeve, as all in Oakhaven do." Godric grunted, unconvinced, but found nothing. Elara had been meticulous, hiding the remaining grain in a hollowed-out log at the very back of their woodpile, a place she doubted he would bother to search thoroughly. He left, still muttering threats, but with no proof. The incident, however, had an unexpected consequence. The villagers, who had witnessed Godric's bullying and were themselves suffering from his exactions, began to look at Elara with a new, guarded respect. They had seen her punished, seen her endure. They had also seen Tom's near-miraculous recovery. Whispers started, not of her guilt, but of her courage. Some even began to suspect the source of her good fortune, and a silent, complicit approval seemed to emanate from them. It was a dangerous sentiment, but it was there. One day Watt, the blacksmith, a man of few words but a strong sense of fairness, approached Elara as she struggled to carry a heavy bundle of firewood. "Here, let me," he said gruffly, taking the load from her. He didn't mention her branded palm, but his calloused hand briefly brushed hers, a gesture of solidarity that spoke volumes. Even Agnes seemed to thaw a little more. "The boy thrives," she commented one afternoon as Elara passed her hut. "Good grain makes strong bones." Her eyes twinkled, just for a moment. A wise woman knows where to find what's needed when the wolves are at the door. These small acts of acceptance, of veiled support, were like pinpricks of light in Elara's grim world. They did not lessen the hardship, but they made it more bearable. The fear of Godric remained, a constant, oppressive weight, but it was no longer Ilara's alone. The village, in its quiet way, was beginning to stir against him. The catalyst came with the spring thaw. As the frozen ground softened, the full extent of the winter's misery became apparent. Several of the older, weaker villages had not survived. The communal stores were all but exhausted. And Reeve Godric, far from showing compassion, announced an increase in the labour dues for the spring planting. Lord Byford, he declared, expected a bumper crop to make up for the previous autumn's failures. A wave of despair, coupled with a simmering anger, swept through Oakhaven. This time, when Godric made his pronouncements in the village square, the usual cowed silence was punctuated by mutters, by openly resentful looks. "We cannot give what we do not have, Reeve," a woman cried out, her voice thin with hunger and desperation. "Our children starve." Godric rounded on her. "Silence, woman, or you'll feel the Lord's displeasure more keenly." But the spark had been lit. Others joined in, their voices rising, a ragged chorus of complaint. "The labour is too much. We have no seed left for our own plots." "You feast while we starve, Godric." Ilara stood at the edge of the crowd, her heart pounding. This was new. This was dangerous. She saw Godric's face flush with anger, his hand instinctively going to the small cudgel he sometimes carried at his belt. Then Giles, her father, a man who had embodied silent endurance for as long as Ilara could remember, stepped forward. His voice was hoarse but surprisingly firm. "Reeve Godric, we are loyal subjects of Lord Byford. We work his land, we pay his dues, but we are men and women, not beasts of burden. We cannot work if we are dead from hunger." A stunned silence fell. For Giles, the most stoic of them all, to speak out was unheard of. Godric stared at him, momentarily speechless, then his face contorted with rage. "You dare, old man? You dare question me?" He advanced on Giles, his cudgel raised. Ilara moved without thinking. She pushed through the crowd and stood between her father and the Reeve. "He speaks the truth, Godric," she said, her voice clear and steady, resonating in the sudden hush. The brand on her palm was visible, a defiant mark. "We are all starving. Your demands are unjust." Godric, faced with Ilara, the branded poacher, the survivor of his lash, hesitated. He saw the faces of the villagers behind her, no longer cowed but watchful, their expressions hard. He was outnumbered. His bluster faltered. This is insubordination," he spluttered. "Lord Byford will hear of this. You will all suffer for this." "Perhaps Lord Byford should hear of how his Reeve starves his loyal tenants while lining his own pockets," Ilara retorted, emboldened by the crowd's silent support. "Perhaps he should see the state of his village, the weakness of his workforce." The standoff was broken by the arrival of Father Alaric, his face pale and anxious. "Brothers and sisters, Reeve Godric, this anger, this discord, it is not God's will." But his words had little effect. The tide had turned. The villagers, finding strength in numbers and in Ilara's unexpected leadership, stood their ground. They did not threaten violence, but their collective refusal to be cowed was a powerful force. Godric, realizing he had lost control of the situation, at least for the moment, backed down, muttering threats of retribution. "You will regret this day," he snarled, before turning and striding back towards his cottage, his dignity in tatters. A ragged cheer went up from the villagers. They surrounded Ilara and Giles, clapping them on the back, their faces alight with a mixture of fear and exhilaration. Tom, who had watched from the doorway of their hut, ran to Ilara, his eyes shining. "You were brave, Ilara," he whispered, clutching her hand, the branded one. Ilara looked at the faces around her. They were still hungry, still poor, still trapped in a brutal system. But for a moment they had found their voices. They had stood together. The scold's silence had been broken, not by one, but by many. She knew this was not the end. Godric would not forget this humiliation. Lord Byford, when he heard of it, would likely react with anger. The future was uncertain, fraught with new dangers. But as Ilara looked at her father, who stood a little taller now, at Tom, whose smile was wide and hopeful, and at the faces of her fellow villagers, she felt a stirring of something she hadn't felt in a long time. It wasn't joy, not yet, but it was a fierce, resilient hope. They had found a small crack in the wall of their oppression, and perhaps, just perhaps, they could widen it. The fight for dignity, for survival, was far from over, but today, in the small, struggling village of Oakhaven, they had won a battle. The aftermath of the confrontation with Reeve Godric was a period of uneasy anticipation. Oakhaven held its breath. The villagers, buoyed by their collective defiance, went about their tasks with a newfound, albeit fragile, sense of unity. They shared what little they had more openly, and small acts of mutual support became commonplace. Alara, though she hadn't sought leadership, found herself a focal point. Villagers would approach her for advice, or simply to offer a quiet word of encouragement. The brand on her palm, once a mark of shame, now seemed to be a symbol of resilience. Godric, for his part, was conspicuously quiet. He kept to his cottage mostly, emerging only to oversee the most essential tasks, his usual bluster replaced by a sullen resentment. He sent word to Lord Byford, of course. Everyone knew that. The question was, how would the Lord react? Weeks passed. The spring planting, though delayed and carried out by weakened bodies, was eventually completed. The days grew longer, and a pale green fuzz began to cover the fields. Tom's health, sustained by the last of the stolen grain and the slightly better rations that came with the communal sharing, remained stable. He even began to help Alara with lighter tasks, his youthful energy slowly returning. Then, one morning, a rider bearing Lord Byford's insignia galloped into the village, a summons. Not for the entire village, as some had feared, but for Alara, Giles, and, to everyone's surprise, Agnes. Reeve Godric was to accompany them. A cold dread settled over Oakhaven. This was it. The reckoning. The journey to the manor was tense. Godric, his confidence seemingly restored by the presence of the Lord's messenger, shot venomous glances at Alara. Giles was pale but resolute. Agnes, her face unreadable, walked with a steady, unhurried pace. Alara herself felt a strange calmness. She had done what she had to do. She would face the consequences. Lord Byford received them in his hall, the same hall where Alara had been sentenced. He looked even more florid than before, his eyes narrowed. "So," he began, his voice a low rumble, "my Reeve tells me of unrest in Oakhaven, of defiance, of challenges to my authority, led, it seems, by a branded poacher and her addled father." His gaze fixed on Alara. "My lord," Alara said, her voice respectful but firm, "we did not challenge your authority. We challenged the cruelty of your Reeve, who starved your tenants while he himself grew fat. We asked only for fairness, for the means to survive, so we could continue to serve you." Godric spluttered. "Lies, my lord! Slander! This woman is a troublemaker, a thief!" "And you, Reeve Godric," Lord Byford said, turning his heavy gaze on his official, "are accused by your entire village of mismanagement, of theft of my property, for the grain they work for is mine until their dues are paid, and of inciting unrest through your harshness. An interesting conundrum, wouldn't you say?" Godric's face went pale. "My lord, they are peasants. They lie to save their own skins." Lord Byford then turned to Agnes. "You, woman, you are old. You have seen many seasons in Oakhaven. What is the truth of this?" Agnes met the Lord's gaze without flinching. Her voice, though old, was clear. "My lord, a good shepherd does not starve his flock in winter, only to demand they give more wool in spring. Reeve Godric has been a harsh master. The people of Oakhaven are loyal, but hunger breeds desperation. The girl Alara," she nodded towards her, "spoke what many felt but dared not say. Her father supported her. The village stood with them because their grievances were just." Lord Byford listened, his fingers drumming on the arm of his chair. The silence in the hall was thick. Alara held her breath. Finally he spoke. "Reeve Godric," he said, his voice dangerously soft. "Your services are no longer required. You will be stripped of your position and your cottage. You may take what you can carry on your back and leave my lands by sunset. Consider yourself fortunate I do not clap you in irons for theft of my goodwill and the potential ruin of my harvest." Godric looked as if he had been struck. He opened his mouth, then closed it, speechless. The Lord's justice, when it came, could be as swift and brutal for a Reeve as for a peasant. Lord Byford then looked at Giles. "Old man, you have some spirit left in you after all. You will act as Reeve for Oakhaven until I find a suitable replacement. See that my dues are collected fairly, and that my people are treated justly. If they thrive, I thrive. Is that understood?" Giles, stunned, could only nod, his eyes wide. Lastly, Lord Byford addressed Alara. "As for you, girl, you are a poacher. That brand will remain. But a flicker of something that might have been grudging respect appeared in his eyes. You also have a tongue in your head and, it seems, the ear of the village. perhaps there is a place for such a woman. He paused. My wife, Lady Anne, has been complaining of the idleness and incompetence of her current household supervisor. She requires someone sharp, someone who understands the value of resources. He looked Alara up and down. You will report to the kitchens tomorrow. If you serve well, you may find a life here better than grubbing in the mud of Oak Haven. If not, he left the threat unspoken. Alara was speechless. From a condemned poacher to a potential servant in the Lord's own household. It was a dizzying turn of events. The journey back to Oak Haven was very different. Godric was gone, a humiliated figure trudging away from the village with a small bundle on his back. Giles, the new acting Reeve, walked with a bewildered but upright posture. Agnes was her usual inscrutable self. When they arrived, the news spread like wildfire. Disbelief turned to jubilation. Godric's downfall was celebrated with a quiet intensity. Alara was hailed as a hero, though she felt more like someone who had stumbled through a storm and somehow found herself on an unexpected shore. The next morning Alara presented herself at the Manor kitchens. Lady Anne Byford was a sharp-featured woman with intelligent eyes who appraised Alara coolly. Life in the Manor was a world away from Oak Haven. There was more food, more warmth, but also a rigid hierarchy, endless tasks, and the constant scrutiny of her new mistress. It was still a form of servitude, but it was a servitude with a roof that didn't leak and a belly that wasn't constantly empty. She learned quickly, her observant nature and pragmatism serving her well. She managed the household stores with a fairness and efficiency that impressed Lady Anne. She still bore the brand on her palm and the scars on her back, but here, among the clatter of the kitchens and the intrigues of the household, they were less a mark of shame and more a testament to a past endured. She saw Tom and her father on her infrequent visits to Oak Haven. Giles, to everyone's surprise, proved to be a fair, if sometimes overly cautious, Reeve. He ensured the Lord's dues were met, but he also listened to the villagers' grievances, and there was a new sense of order, of fragile hope in Oak Haven. Tom was growing stronger, learning the ways of the field under his father's guidance. Alara's life was still one of hardship, of long hours and little freedom. But the gnawing fear, the constant threat of starvation and arbitrary cruelty had receded. She had found, not the peace she had once vaguely dreamed of, but a different kind of survival, a space where her intelligence and resilience were valued, however grudgingly. Sometimes in the quiet of the night, in her small attic room in the manor, she would look at the branded P on her palm. It no longer burned with shame. It was a reminder. A reminder of the forest, of Tom's fever, of Godric's cruelty, and of the day the villagers of Oak Haven had found their voice, with hers among them. The scold's silence had been broken, and though her own voice was now confined to the running of a household, she knew that the echoes of that broken silence still resonated in the wind that swept across the fields of Oak Haven. And that, she thought, was a victory in itself. Life within the stone walls of Lord Byford's manor was a labyrinth of new rules and unspoken expectations for Alara. The sheer abundance of food, even in the kitchens where she now held a position of minor authority overseeing stores and the younger scullery maids, was a constant source of quiet astonishment. She remembered the gnawing hunger of Oak Haven, the desperate measures taken for a single rabbit, and a part of her always felt like an outsider, a peasant girl masquerading in slightly better wool. Lady Anne Byford was a demanding mistress, her moods as changeable as the English weather. But she was also shrewd, and she recognized Alara's quick mind and innate honesty. Alara learned to navigate the lady's temper, to anticipate her needs, and to manage the often squabbling kitchen staff with a firm but fair hand. The brand on her palm was noted, of course. Some of the higher-ranking servants whispered about the poacher girl Lady Anne had inexplicably favoured. Alara ignored them. She had faced worse than whispers. Her days were long, beginning before dawn with the checking of supplies, flour, salted meats, dried herbs, ale, wine, and ending late after the lord and lady had supped and the last of the kitchen fires were banked. She learned about different cuts of meat, the subtle art of seasoning, a world away from Oak Haven's perpetual pottage, and the complex logistics of feeding a noble household. It was a different kind of toil from fieldwork, less physically brutal perhaps, but mentally exhausting in its own way. She missed the open sky of Oakhaven, the feel of earth beneath her feet. But she did not miss the constant grinding fear of starvation or the arbitrary cruelty of a man like Godric. Here, there was a structure, a set of rules, often unfair, always hierarchical, but rules nonetheless. And within those rules, Alara found a way to carve out a small measure of security. Her father, Giles, visited the manor periodically to deliver dues or report on Oakhaven's affairs. He seemed to have aged, yet paradoxically, he also seemed less burdened. The responsibility of being Reeve sat heavily on him, but it was a responsibility he carried with a surprising dignity. "The village, it fares better, Alara," he told her during one visit, his voice low as they stood in a quiet corner of the bustling bailey. The spring planting was good. Lord Byford was content with the yields. There is less fear now that Godric is gone. "And Tom?" Alara always asked, her heart quickening. "He grows strong," Giles said, a rare smile touching his lips, "works hard, asks after you often." He looked at her then, at her cleaner tunic, the way she held herself with a new, quiet confidence. "This life, it suits you better than the fields?" Alara considered. "It is different, father, safer in some ways, but I am still a servant." Giles nodded. "We're all servants to someone, child. It is the way of the world." One autumn, nearly 2 years after she had come to the manor, whispers of a terrible sickness reached even the insulated world of Lord Byford's household. A pestilence, they called it, sweeping across the sea from the east, felling entire towns. At first it was a distant rumour, something to be discussed with a shiver of fear but quickly dismissed. But the rumours grew more persistent, more detailed, more terrifying. Lady Anne became agitated, ordering the gates to be barred to all but the most essential visitors, burning pungent herbs throughout the manor to cleanse the air. Lord Byford scoffed at what he called women's hysterics, but even he began to look uneasy. Then it arrived in the nearby market town. People dying in their homes, their bodies marked with black swellings. Panic began to ripple outwards. Oakhaven, being somewhat remote, was spared for a time. But Alara lived in dread. She thought of Tom, of her father, of the villagers who had, in their own way, stood with her. She remembered Tom's fever, her desperate run to the forest. This new sickness, they said, was a different beast entirely. No herbs, no poultices seemed to touch it. One day a distraught messenger arrived from Oakhaven. Several villagers had fallen ill. Father Aric was dead. Giles, her father, was sick. Alara went to Lady Anne, her heart cold with a familiar terror. "My lady, I must go to Oakhaven." "My father?" Lady Anne looked at her, her face pale. The fear of the pestilence was a great leveller. "It is madness, girl. To go into a plague-stricken village, you will surely die." "He is my father, my lady." Alara's voice was quiet but unshakable. "And my brother is there." Lady Anne hesitated. For all her demanding ways, there was a core of something human within her. Perhaps she saw in Alara's eyes the same fierce loyalty she felt for her own kin. "The manor gates are sealed," she said finally. "I cannot officially permit you to leave, but—" She looked away. "If the scullery gate were to be left unlatched for an hour after nightfall, I would not know of it, and you would not return. Is that understood?" Alara understood. It was a dismissal, but a compassionate one, a chance. "Thank you, my lady." That night Alara slipped out of the manor, carrying a small bundle of bread, some dried meat and a few precious herbs she had managed to purloin from the manor's stores. Not for cure, she knew that was unlikely, but for comfort. The journey to Oakhaven under a cold starlit sky was a journey back into a world she thought she had escaped, a world now gripped by a terror far greater than Reeve Godric or Lord Byford. Oakhaven was a village of ghosts. Huts were shuttered, an unnatural silence hanging over everything. The air itself seemed to smell of sickness and fear. She found her father in their old hut, tended by a terrified but resolute Tom. Giles was gravely ill, his skin burning, the telltale swellings already visible. Alara took over the nursing, her manor-learned skills in cleanliness and care a stark contrast to the primitive conditions. She cleaned her father, offered him sips of water, spoke to him in low, soothing tones, though she knew it was likely hopeless. Tom, exhausted but relieved by her presence, clung to her. "Agnes, she is dead, Alara," Tom whispered, his face streaked with tears. "And what the blacksmith, so many." Days blurred into a nightmare of tending to the dying, of fear, of the constant, cloying smell of sickness. Giles passed away 2 days after Ilara arrived. She and Tom, their faces masked with vinegar-soaked rags, buried him in the small churchyard, their grief a raw, open wound. In the midst of this desolation, Ilara found herself drawing on a strength she didn't know she possessed. She organized the few remaining healthy villagers, mostly the younger ones like Tom. They brought food and water to the sick, disposed of the dead with as much reverence as they could muster, and tried to maintain some semblance of order in a world that was falling apart. The brand on her palm, the scars on her back, were forgotten. Here, in the face of a truly indiscriminate enemy, such past grievances seemed trivial. The pestilence eventually ran its course in Oakhaven, as it did elsewhere, leaving a shattered, depleted community in its wake. Nearly half the villagers were dead. Tom had survived miraculously. Ilara, too, had been spared. In the quiet aftermath, as the survivors slowly began to pick up the pieces of their lives, Ilara knew she could not return to the manor. Her place for now was here in Oakhaven, among the people who had shared her past, her defiance, and now, this terrible new sorrow. The village needed leaders, and Ilara, the branded poacher, the household supervisor, the survivor, found herself once again stepping into a role she had never sought. The future was more uncertain than ever. The old feudal order was shaken by the sheer scale of the deaths. Labour was scarce and lords were desperate. Perhaps Ilara thought, in this new, devastated world, there might be opportunities for change, for a different kind of life. The scold's silence had been broken by defiance, then by grief. Now, perhaps, it was time for the silence to be filled with the sound of rebuilding, of resilience, of a future, however harsh, that they would face together. The scars remained, but so did the spirit. The spring that followed the great pestilence was unlike any Oakhaven had ever seen. The fields lay fallow in many places, their former tenders now silent beneath the sod of the overcrowded churchyard. The air, though fresh with new growth, still carried a lingering scent of sorrow and the faint, metallic tang of fear. Of the 100 or so souls that had once called Oakhaven home, fewer than 50 remained. Ilara, with Tom by her side, found herself at the heart of the village's struggle for survival. Her father, Giles, was gone, and with him the reluctant mantle of Reeve had, by unspoken consent, fallen upon her shoulders. Lord Byford, his own household and lands decimated by the plague, had not sent a replacement. He had larger problems than a remote village like Oakhaven. For now, they were largely left to their own devices. It was a daunting task. There were too few hands to work the land effectively. The old social order, while not gone, was severely weakened. Fear of a return of the sickness was a constant undercurrent. But amidst the despair, a new spirit began to emerge, born of shared trauma and a desperate need to rebuild. Ilara, drawing on the organisational skills she'd honed in Lord Byford's manor, began to direct the village's efforts. She proposed that they pool their remaining livestock and work the most fertile of the Lord's fields communally, rather than trying to maintain the old inefficient strip system with their depleted numbers. There was grumbling at first, old habits died hard, but the stark reality of their situation won out. We work together, or we starve together. Ilara stated plainly at a village gathering, her voice carrying a new authority. The brand on her palm was visible as she gestured. It no longer felt like a mark of shame, but a testament to her journey. The Lord's dues will still need to be paid when he remembers us. But first we must feed ourselves. We must ensure Oakhaven survives. Tom, now a young man forged in the crucible of loss and hardship, became her quiet, steadfast supporter. He had his father's endurance and Ilara's observant nature. He organised the younger boys and girls into foraging parties, gathering firewood, nuts and berries from the forest, a forest whose rules now seemed less important than the immediate needs of the living. The work was relentless from dawn till dusk. Ilara toiled alongside the others, her hands, once softened by manor life, quickly becoming calloused again. She settled disputes, allocated meagre resources, and offered comfort where she could. She learned to read the weather, to judge the soil, to make hard decisions with a fairness that earned her the grudging respect of even the oldest villagers. One evening, as they sat by a communal fire, sharing a thin stew made from pooled ingredients, Old Man Hemlock, one of Oakhaven's few surviving elders, looked at Ilara. "You lead well, girl," he said, his voice raspy. "Like your father, but with more fire. Alara felt a warmth spread through her. It wasn't praise she sought, but the knowledge that she was making a difference, however small, was a balm to her weary spirit. The summer was hard, but they managed. The communal fields, worked with a desperate efficiency, yielded a modest but sufficient harvest. They had enough to see them through the coming winter, and perhaps even a small surplus for the Lord's dues, if and when he demanded them. Word began to trickle in from the outside world. Tales of villages entirely wiped out, of nobles struggling to find enough labourers to work their vast estates. The balance of power, so long skewed, was subtly shifting. Peasants, now a scarce commodity, were beginning to realise their own worth. Some were demanding better conditions, higher wages, or even leaving their ancestral lands in search of new opportunities. This news sparked a new kind of discussion in Oakhaven. Could they, too, demand more? Could they negotiate with Lord Byford for a reduction in dues, for more control over their own lives? Alara was cautious. "Lord Byford is still our lord," she reminded them. "He has lost much. He may not be in a mood for charity or for negotiation." But the seed of an idea had been planted. The old fear was still there, but it was now tempered by a newfound sense of collective strength. They had survived the pestilence. They had rebuilt their lives from the ashes. They were no longer just a collection of cowed peasants. They were the survivors of Oakhaven. As autumn approached, a messenger did arrive from Lord Byford, not a demand for dues, as they had expected, but a summons for Alara to attend him at the manor. There was no threat in the summons, merely a request. A ripple of anxiety went through the village. Was this a trap? Was the Lord finally ready to reassert his authority, to punish them for their newfound independence? Tom was adamant. "You should not go, Alara. It is too dangerous." But Alara knew she had to. She was their reeve, their leader. She could not show fear. "I will go," she said. "Oakhaven has nothing to hide. We have worked hard. We have survived. Let him see what we have accomplished." She journeyed to the manor, this time not as a prisoner or a servant, but as the representative of her village. The manor itself felt different, quieter, less opulent. Many of the familiar faces among the servants were gone, replaced by new, often younger ones. The plague had left its mark here too. Lord Byford received her not in the grand hall, but in his private study, a smaller, more intimate room. He looked older, his face lined with worry, his usual boisterousness subdued. Lady Anne sat beside him, her expression sombre. "Alara of Oakhaven," Lord Byford began, his voice lacking its former boom. "I have heard reports that your village survived, that you have organised them." "We did what we had to, my lord," Alara replied. "To live." "Many villages did not," Lady Anne said softly, her gaze on Alara. "Many lords have lost everything." Lord Byford leaned forward. "Labour is scarce, Alara. Good, hard-working tenants are worth more than gold these days. Oakhaven has always been productive when well managed." He paused. "Your father was a good reeve in his way, and you seem to have a head for it." He then made a proposal that stunned Alara. He offered Oakhaven new terms. A reduction in the traditional labour dues, to be replaced by a fixed rent in coin or kind. More freedom for the villagers to manage their own plots, to sell any surplus they produced at market. In return, he expected Oakhaven to remain loyal, to provide a steady supply of grain to his depleted household, and for Alara to continue as reeve, formally appointed this time, with a small stipend. It was an unprecedented offer, a recognition of their new reality, of their worth. Alara listened, her mind racing. This was more than she could have ever hoped for. Freedom from the most onerous labour dues, the chance to build something for themselves. "And if we agree, my lord," she asked, "then Oakhaven may yet prosper," Lord Byford said, "and I will have one less worry in these accursed times." He looked directly at her. "You are a survivor, Alara, like me, like this whole blighted land. We must find new ways to endure." Alara returned to Oakhaven with the news. There was disbelief, then caution, then a dawning, incredulous joy. It was not full freedom, not by any means. They were still tenants of Lord Byford, but it was a significant step, a recognition of their resilience, their value. That evening, as a new, more hopeful fire burned in the centre of the village, Alara stood and looked at the faces around her. They were still scarred by loss, their lives still harsh. But there was a light in their eyes that had not been there before. The brand on her palm still ached sometimes, a reminder of the cruelty of the old ways. But now it also felt like a symbol of a different kind of power, the power of a community that had faced the darkness and chosen to rebuild together. The Scold's silence had been broken long ago. Now, in its place, were the sounds of a village learning to speak its own name, to forge its own future, one difficult, hopeful day at a time. The years that followed were a testament to Oakhaven's resilience and to Alara's quiet, steady leadership. The new terms with Lord Byford, while still demanding, offered a sliver of autonomy that the village seized with both hands. They diversified their crops, planting not just barley and rye for the Lord, but also beans, peas, and even small patches of flax for linen on their own consolidated plots. The communal spirit born of the plague's aftermath did not entirely dissipate. They helped each other with the harvest, shared tools, and looked out for the widows and orphans the sickness had left behind. Alara, as the formally appointed Reeve, found her days filled with a different kind of labour. She arbitrated disputes over land boundaries, kept the accounts of the village's dues to Lord Byford, and represented Oakhaven in dealings with neighbouring villages or itinerant traders. It was a heavy responsibility, and there were days when she longed for the simpler, if more brutal, anonymity of fieldwork. But she also found a deep satisfaction in seeing Oakhaven slowly, painstakingly recover. Tom grew into a capable young man, his early frailty replaced by a wiry strength. He became Alara's right hand, his knowledge of the land and the villagers invaluable. He married a quiet, hard-working girl from a neighbouring hamlet, one of the many small shifts in population as survivors sought to rebuild their communities. Their small hut built near Alara's was often filled with the scent of baking bread, a sound and smell of simple prosperity that had once been unimaginable. Lord Byford, chastened by the plague and increasingly reliant on the steady income from a recovering Oakhaven, mostly left them to their own devices, as long as his rents were paid. He even consulted Alara on occasion about agricultural matters, a grudging respect having grown between the pragmatic lord and the peasant woman who had defied and then served him. Lady Anne sometimes sent gifts of cloth or salt to the village, small tokens of goodwill. The manor, though still a symbol of power, no longer felt like a place of dread to Alara. The brand on Alara's palm faded over time, the angry red turning to a pale silvery mark. It was still there, a part of her history, but it no longer defined her in the eyes of the village, or even in her own. She was Reeve Alara, the woman who had helped Oakhaven rise from its ashes. There were still hardships, of course. Bad harvests came, though not as devastatingly as before. Sickness still visited, but the community was better prepared, more knowledgeable about basic hygiene, lessons learned in the cruelest way. The world outside Oakhaven remained a dangerous and unpredictable place. But within their small corner of it, they had forged a measure of stability, a sense of shared purpose. One late summer evening, years after the great pestilence, Alara sat outside her hut, watching the children of Oakhaven, a new generation, born after the darkness, playing in the fading light. Tom sat beside her, his own infant daughter asleep in his arms. The air was filled with the scent of wood smoke and ripening apples. "Do you ever think of before?" Tom asked quietly, his gaze on the distant, darkening line of the forest. "Godric? The lashing?" Alara looked at her hand, at the faint mark there. "Sometimes," she admitted, "it feels like another life, another person." She paused, then said, "But we are still here, Tom. That is what matters." He nodded, understanding. "You were brave then, Alara, when you went to the forest for me, when you faced Godric." "I was desperate," Alara said, "and angry. Sometimes desperation and anger are all one has to fight with." She looked at the children, their laughter echoing in the twilight. "But now we have more. We have each other. We have Oakhaven." A young girl, no older than 7, with bright, curious eyes, approached them. It was Wat the blacksmith's granddaughter. "Reeve Alara," she said, "Grandsire says the new ploughshare is ready, and he says to tell you there's talk of a new tax from the king's men coming through." Alara sighed. The struggles never truly ended. There would always be new challenges, new demands from the world beyond their village. But as she looked at the girl's unafraid face, at Tom's steady presence beside her, at the dim lights beginning to glow in the huts of Oakhaven, she felt not despair, but a quiet resolve. "Thank you, child," she said. Tell your grandsire I will see him in the morning, and we will face what comes, as we always do." The girl scampered off. Alara watched her go, a small smile playing on her lips. The scold's bridle was a relic of a past she had helped to change, however incrementally. The silence it had once represented had been replaced by the voices of a community that had learned to speak up, to endure, and to hope. Her own voice, once nearly silenced by fear and oppression, was now one of quiet leadership, guiding Oakhaven towards a future that, while still uncertain, was one they were shaping with their own scarred, resilient hands. The journey had been brutal, the cost immense, but in the enduring spirit of Oakhaven, Alara found her own hard-won peace. As the seasons continued to turn, Oakhaven settled into a rhythm of cautious prosperity. The king's new tax came and went, a burden negotiated by Alara with a skill that surprised even herself, leveraging the village's recovered productivity against the crown's need for compliant tax-paying shires. Lord Byford, growing older and increasingly content to leave the running of his more distant holdings to capable hands, interfered less and less. Alara never married. Her life was Oakhaven, her family its people. She watched Tom's children grow, teaching them the names of the herbs in the forest, the ways of the fields, and the stories of their village, not just the old tales, but the newer ones, of hardship, survival, and the quiet courage of ordinary folk. She made sure they knew about the great pestilence, not to frighten them, but to remind them of what they had overcome, of the preciousness of community. The brand on her palm became a curiosity to the younger generation, a story mark. When asked, Alara would tell them a simplified version, not dwelling on the pain, but on the lesson, that laws could be unjust, and sometimes one had to take risks for those they loved. She never glorified poaching, but she never shied away from the truth of her own desperate act. One year, a travelling scholar, a man collecting local histories and customs, passed through Oakhaven. He was intrigued by the story of their survival, of their woman Reeve. He spent many evenings by Alara's hearth, listening as she spoke of the old days, of Godric, of the plague, and of the slow rebuilding. "You have seen much change, Reeve Alara," he commented one night, his quill scratching across parchment. Alara looked into the flames. "The world changes, whether we wish it or not. We can only try to meet it with what strength we have." "And you found strength here?" he asked, gesturing to the humble village. "We found it in each other," Alara corrected gently. "When the worst came, we learned that even the smallest voice, joined with others, can make a sound loud enough to be heard, even if it begins in a scold's silence." The scholar wrote that down, a thoughtful expression on his face. Alara lived to a ripe old age for those times, her hair turning the silver of the winter frost, her face deeply etched with the lines of a life fully, if harshly, lived. She remained Reeve of Oakhaven until her last days, her counsel sought, her wisdom respected. When she finally passed, quietly in her sleep, the entire village mourned. They buried her in the churchyard beside her father, under the shade of the ancient oak that gave the village its name. No grand stone marked her grave, just a simple wooden cross like all the others. But her legacy was not in stone. It was in the tilled fields of Oakhaven, in the laughter of its children, in the quiet resilience of its people. It was in the memory of a woman who had borne the marks of oppression but had refused to be defined by them, who had found her voice in the face of brutality and had used it to lead her community out of the darkness. The story of Alara, the branded poacher who became their Reeve, became one of Oakhaven's most cherished tales, a reminder that even in the harshest of times, courage, compassion, and a refusal to be silenced could carve out a space for hope and for a better, if still imperfect, world.